Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight on this Wednesday, December 19th. Chicago police officers charged with conspiracy in the Laquan McDonald case will have to wait until next year to learn their fate.
Political considerations have played no role whatsoever in our discussions or decisions about monetary policy.
Ignoring criticism from President Trump, the Fed hikes benchmark interest rates for the fourth time this year.
It was hard not seeing anybody that I knew. There are days I look out the window wondering what my family was doing at that moment.
A new lawsuit claims DCFS is keeping kids in psych wards beyond medical necessity. We hear from the plaintiff in that case.
For getting on the ballot, you have to have 12,500 signatures. The rules are the same for everybody.
Toni Preckwinkle drops her petition challenge of Susana Mendoza as a new poll is out in the race for Chicago mayor. Those stories and more in our weekly Spotlight Politics.
The waves are pretty big today. Not really that clean, but still getting some fun rides out of the waves.
Surfers brave the cold weather to ride some waves on Lake Michigan in northwest Indiana. Jeffrey Bear floats some theories about one of Chicago's most enduring mysteries. And capturing icons of the 1960s and 70s, one photographer's view of famous people and the fight for civil rights. All that and more next on Chicago Tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Ponce. A late development in the deaths of two Chicago police officers. Eddie Aruza has that story and more of what's making news in Chicago tonight. Eddie.
Phil, late this afternoon, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office announced charges against a 24-year-old man in connection with the deaths of police officer Conrad Gary and Eduardo Marmolejo. The suspect is identified as Edward Brown, and he's charged with aggravated unlawful use of a weapon and reckless discharge of a firearm. Gary and Marmolejo were killed after being hit by a South Shore Metro train Monday afternoon as they pursued a suspected gunman along the rail tracks at the 103rd Street Rosemore stop. Police officials say two commuter trains were running in opposite directions, but the officers only saw one of them. Funerals for the two Chicago police officers will take place at the same church, St. Rita of Cascia Shrine Chapel at 7740 Southwestern Avenue. Gary's will be Friday morning, Marmolejo's the next day. Gary was 31 years old, Marmolejo 36. Each had been on the force for less than 3 years. Both were married and had young children. Their deaths bring the number of Chicago police officers killed in the line of duty this year to 4. Illinois Attorney General Lisa Madigan has released a preliminary report on sex abuse by Illinois Catholic clergy that claims the number of alleged abusers is far greater than what the church has revealed so far. The report says nearly 700 members of the clergy have been accused. That's 4 times higher than Catholic officials have identified. The Attorney General's office also says none of the 6 dioceses in Illinois has established policies to hold church officials responsible for covering up the abuse of children. In a statement this afternoon, Cardinal Blaise Cupich expressed regret for what he said was the church's failure to address the scourge of clerical sexual abuse, and he vowed to strengthen the culture of healing, protection, and accountability. A delegation from Chicago was among the invited guests at the unveiling of Elon Musk's first tunnel in Hawthorne, California, constructed by Musk's The Boring Company. The mile-long underground tube could serve as a prototype for the $1 billion Hyperloop Musk has been tapped to construct between the Loop and O'Hare Airport. The test tunnel, however, ran only Electra Tesla automobiles outfitted with rubber bumpers that traveled far slower than the high speeds Musk says would set his Hyperloop apart. But the eccentric entrepreneur insists it's only the beginning.
This is something that I think will actually work. It's scalable, and we have a demonstration tunnel here, and we expect to expand this over time to many cities all around the world.
36th Ward Alderman Gilbert Villegas was among the Chicagoans who took a test drive in the tunnel. He called it bumpy, saying it left him with a lot of questions about its viability for a 17-mile O'Hare Loop connection. As for the weather, cloudy with a chance of rain tonight and a low around 39. Then cloudy skies tomorrow with more rain likely and an unseasonably high temperature of around 43. Don't forget, you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. And you can also watch via podcast and the PBS video app. And now, Phil, back to you.
Thank you, Eddie. 3 Chicago police officers accused of conspiring to cover up details of the Laquan McDonald shooting will have to wait until 2019 to learn their fate. The judge was originally scheduled to issue a verdict today, but has now rescheduled it for January 15th. Here now with more is WTTW News reporter Matt Masterson, who's been following this unprecedented case and was in court today. So, Matt, what happened today?
So like you said, today was initially supposed to be the verdict date, but instead earlier this week, the judge handling the case delayed her verdict for it for these 3 men, Joseph Walsh, Thomas Gaffney, and David March. She did not give a specific reason, so today instead functioned more as a scheduling hearing. The judge was eyeing a new date in early January, but some more scheduling issues between the prosecutor and the defense cropped up, so they eventually settled on, like you said, January 15th, 2019. Now, not only is that in the new year, but it's also the same week, 3 days before Jason Van Dyke, the officer who shot Laquan McDonald, is scheduled to be sentenced.
Was there any explanation for the delay?
Not that we received earlier this week when the announcement was made, and the judge really didn't say much more about it today. She didn't give any specific explanation whether this had anything to do with the upcoming holidays or whether she simply wanted more time to go over the witness testimony and the pages and pages of documents in the case that were submitted as evidence. Stevenson didn't have much to say today. The attorneys didn't have much to say. The case is more or less over. The trial portion is over. We're just awaiting this verdict. So today's hearing lasted only a few brief minutes before it was over.
I understand Laquan McDonald's uncle spoke afterwards and said this trial might be even more important than the trial of Jason Van Dyke.
I think that this is very important. We've never had police officers charged for lying about putting people in jail. And then we go about as citizens in this city acting as this is something that has never happened when we have John Burrs and so on and so forth. And when the Justice Department in itself said that Chicago Police Department is the most corrupt police department they've ever saw.
So why is this trial important?
Well, the trial of Jason Van Dyke certainly made bigger headlines, but the verdict in this case could also have a big impact on the Chicago Police Department and its officers. The Van Dyke trial focused on one incident, right, just the shooting of Laquan McDonald. But this case focuses more on how some officers may do their job, this supposed code of silence that some officers follow to cover for their own and to try to cover up an incident like the shooting of Laquan McDonald. So there hasn't really been a case where officers have been put on trial for lying in these circumstances or following this so-called code. So if the verdict of guilty does come down for these men, it could have a major impact on whether or not this so-called code could be allowed to continue.
Matt, thank you. And now to Carol Marine and questions about interest rates, the markets, and the economy. Carol.
Phil, thank you. The Federal Reserve today hiked its benchmark interest rate for the 4th time this year by 0.25% to 2.5%. Fed Chair Jerome Powell has a tricky task in trying to reassure markets that the economy is strong enough to take another rate hike, while at the same time not tipping it into recession. And he's been drawing fire from the man who appointed him, President Trump, who has attacked the Fed on Twitter for raising rates and triggering a stock market sell-off. And just yesterday, former Fed Chair Alan Greenspan unnerved investors when he declared the bull market all but over.
It would be very surprising to see it sort of stabilize here and then take off again. But it's happened in the past. However, at the end of that one, run for cover.
Joining us to share their insights on the economy, the markets, and the outlook for 2019 are Susan Schmidt, head of U.S. equities at asset manager Aviva Investors, and Mark Horner, founder and financial advisor at Fairhaven Wealth Management. Welcome back, both of you, to Chicago Tonight. Here. So, Susan, Alan Greenspan delivers that point of view from the mountaintop, and what happened?
Yes, well, that is not the first time we've heard some of the investors in the market, pundits say that, you know, we're ready for things to collapse. We've been in this recovery for a long time, and there's been a long upward trend. So almost everyone is prepared for this to start slowing down. The question is when. And we'll hear that phrase peak earnings a lot. Have we passed the peak? Is this as good as it can get? And I think that's where investors start to panic if we take that, because they assume it's a roller coaster ride, that it's immediately going to be a precipitous drop. That's not necessarily the case. And unfortunately, Greenspan's use of words might imply that roller coaster ride that isn't necessarily the path forward.
So, Mark, run for cover.
Right.
Run for cover. Now, that's not a sort of tranquil way to explain what you ought to do.
It's not, and neither is irrational exuberance, which is the other phrase that he's famous for. And I think a lot of people forget the timing of that statement that he made, which was in 1996. So 2+ years before a turn actually happened in that market. And I think I think that just goes to evaluating track records of Wall Street prognosticators. They're generally not that good. And so a lot of attention today is being paid to the Fed minutes. For me, the more interesting document from the Fed was back in 2017, where a report was published where they reviewed their own accuracy of forecasts and gave themselves a horrible record. Or rating, rather.
A flunking grade?
They did, and the trend was not positive. They actually said the accuracy of their forecasts, whether that be economic growth, interest rate forecasts in the future, is actually trending down since 2008. So I think there's a lot of hoopla that goes around the announcement of Fed speak. But I really think for individual investors, it's important to put recent market activity in context and really focus on issues that they can control, and the Fed is not one of them.
So was it a good decision by the Fed today?
It's too soon to tell. These are things that we don't know how this is going to affect the economy until we look back in 6 months and reassess. And I think what the Fed did was largely expected by the market. The market was predicting that there would be a 25 bip, 0.25% increase to rates. So that wasn't the surprise. The surprise to the market was that I think they were really looking for more reassurance in the tone and the comments afterwards that the Fed would be there to support the economy. We're raising rates now in an environment that suddenly has headwinds, whereas when we looked at this at the beginning of 2018, we had tailwinds. And so this is changing the perspective of the market, and that volatility has brought nervousness back to the investor.
There is a take on this, however, that what the Fed did today was a demonstration that it was not going to be bullied by the president who disapproves of this. That would assume that they pay attention to his Twitter feed and to politics, which we heard the Fed chairman say absolutely doesn't happen. Does it, Mark?
I don't know that it does. President Powell at the Fed. So actually, President Obama originally introduced him into the Fed system, and then President Trump appointed him as president. I think he's a I don't know him personally, but looking at his resume, he's a seasoned business person, and I think regardless of where one falls politically in terms of how you feel about President Trump, I think it's fair to say that he can behave a bit like a loose cannon. And my strong inclination is that Chairman Powell is not paying a whole lot of attention to 2 in the morning tweets.
But the consumer is paying attention to the stock market, and the stock market today had another dismal down day. Both of you talk to investors all the time. So what do you say to them?
So I think that goes back to context, to putting what we're experiencing in the market in context. So the stock market does not move up in a straight line. Numbers of average annual returns of 9 to 10% are, I think most people are familiar with. What a lot of people are not familiar with is that what we've gone through just recently, these last 3 months, this is pretty normal. Going back to 1980, there has been a move from the top during a calendar year, the move from a top in the stock market to the bottom on average of about 14% down in every single calendar year going back to 1980. So while what we've experienced over the last 2 or 3 months, it's been more dramatic than it usually is, it's pretty normal in the context of investing.
It's new because we haven't felt it since the recovery. So we are at correction levels now. We're down 10% from the highs in our major indices, but the market isn't used to this kind of volatility. We've had a very long, extended, multi-year period of low volatility. So to see this bounce back, in historic context, it's not that extreme, but relative to recent years, it is. And people aren't used to it. We have a very emotional market that's perhaps helped along by some emotional tweets that come out around the market. And at the same time, we're at a tough position and point of the economic cycle. So CEOs are coming out talking about earnings, talking about pressures ahead. We're seeing a different tone from them, and all of that is leading to cautiousness. I think the phrase from most investors, professional investors today, is, I just want the year to end. So we really have a tough period right now with no news, and that's the danger. Until we get into 2019, we're in a news vacuum. So be prepared. There's going to be more volatility because there's nothing really for the market to grab onto as a hard, cold fact.
So one of the hard, cold facts is about unemployment. While unemployment is down, wage growth is not up. And so there is that whole question of whether that constitutes growth, even though we're told that the economy has grown. For a lot of people, when you use the word recovery, Susan, there are still an awful lot of people in the middle class and the lower middle class that don't know what a recovery even looks like to this day. So what do we make of the unemployment situation and the wage situation?
Well, I think when you talk about recovery, let's talk about the consumer for a second and talk about consumer confidence. Consumer confidence is incredibly high, and that gives me a lot of comfort that the grassroots economy is still feeling pretty good. Consumer confidence is high. Small businesses feel good about what they're doing. They want to invest in the business, and we are seeing people who feel very confident in quitting a job and moving to another one because there's an opportunity for them. At the same time, we do have an issue in that how is wage growth impacting things? We're seeing right now, I think, a good position for the consumer coming into the holiday season where gas prices are down, the consumer seems to be continuing to spend, and we're looking at that confidence level very closely at Aviva Investors to make sure that we understand how that's tracking. Unemployment, that number is difficult because there are a lot of moving components to it. Demographics play a huge part, and while it's low, I'm not sure that that data captures all of the current situation.
Well, so I completely agree that the wage growth has not been what it should be, has not matched the economic growth. For me, I think that goes back to accessibility of education. The data is overwhelming that the more people move up the educational experience level, that earnings follow. And so I would love to see our political leaders do something about making education more broadly affordable for all and accessible. I think if an educated workforce is just naturally going to be more productive, both for their employers, but also for themselves.
When it comes to President Trump's tax cuts, where do we see that in terms of what it has produced in the economy, or do we see something?
I think it might be a little early to judge that. I have seen some estimates that maybe in 2019 the tax cuts could account for as much as 2% of additional GDP growth, so economic growth, but I think it's a little too soon.
Well, and that's hard to judge because we're coming up against a very tough comp, and we talk about tailwinds in 2018 that caused this rise in the markets. The tax cuts were a big part of that. So seeing that reduced tax level, businesses were more profitable, that then inspired an increase in the share prices. And we don't really know, again, the economy, it takes a long time for things to play out. So is that really going to contribute to growth longer term? We won't know for a multi-year period,
and
really.
Going back to that previous discussion, will it contribute to wage growth? Will that be a pass-through from employers to employees? We still haven't really seen that.
We haven't. We saw some initially when the tax cuts were announced. There was an immediate increase in announcements of minimum wage, benefits, bonuses for employees, and that seems to be a one-time thing. Some of those wages where the base wage was increased have stayed at that higher level, but we haven't seen more announcements like that. And one of the things that the Fed is looking at is inflation, and increasing wages is part of what drives inflation. So it's a tricky balancing act right now.
So a Christmas message for your investors, if you could summarize it in in a kind of Hallmark card greeting would be, Mark?
Well, that's a challenge. I would say control the controllables and try to ignore the rest. And so specifically, maybe what somebody could start doing tomorrow morning is to look at their portfolio and make sure that they don't have any unnecessary tax obligations waiting for them. So we're working hard on that with our clients to make sure portfolios are tax optimized. And then if you've been staying up at night with recent market volatility, it's always a good time to re-review your financial plan and make sure your portfolio's appropriately positioned.
A little longer than a Hallmark card.
I don't think that fit on a card.
It's a little bit longer.
But it's a heartfelt wish. Listen, both of you, thank you very much, and may your holidays be wonderful.
Thank you.
And yours.
More on Chicago Tonight just ahead. Stay with us.
Still to come on Chicago Tonight, Toni Preckwinkle drops her opposition to Susana Mendoza's petitions in the race for Chicago mayor. Surfing the waves of Lake Michigan in Whiting, Indiana during frigid weather. The story of a mansion-turned-egg warehouse in tonight's Ask Jeffrey. And a photographer remembers his civil rights era photos, plus his pictures of superstars. But first, more than 800 foster children who were hospitalized in Illinois for mental health issues between 2015 and 2017 stayed past the point of medical necessity. For some, that stay was months longer than what the doctor prescribed. That's according to a new class action lawsuit filed against the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. The lawsuit claims DCFS is, quote, warehousing kids in psychiatric hospitals instead of finding them home somewhere else. Joining us to discuss the lawsuit and the issues at hand is the plaintiff, Charles Goldberg, Cook County's acting public guardian. And thank you for being here. First of all, a little bit more on what the lawsuit is alleging.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, hundreds of children in DCFS care, when they need psychiatric care and they're done, DCFS doesn't have any place for them to go, and they languish in the hospital, locked facilities for weeks and even months. And the lawsuit is intended to end that.
And we mentioned a figure in the introduction, but tell us a little bit more about the number of children that you allege have been impacted, and over what span of time?
So we talk about 17 different children in the lawsuit. We're asking the federal court to certify a class that'll be hundreds and hundreds of children. It goes back 10 years. And the number you mentioned, the 800 children over those 3 years, if you multiply the number of months, weeks and months that they all spent in the hospital after they're ready to leave, it adds up to 75 years of children's life during that short 2-year span that you just mentioned.
What do you want CFS to do?
So they just need to build more placements for these kids. I know that DCFS's response is this is so complicated and this is so hard and complex. It's really not. We know the placements that these children need. DCFS has the placements that these children need. In fact, all the children eventually go to a placement. It's just that they're on waiting lists for weeks and months, and they're locked in these hospitals during that period of time. And DCFS, remarkably, in the last 3 years, has cut back their number of residential beds by 500. In 2016, they asked for a 30% reduction in the number of residential beds. In 2018, they asked for another 30% reduction in the number of residential beds. And of course, not surprisingly, the number of children and the length of time that these children remained in locked psychiatric hospitals has gone up each of those years proportionally. So,
well, excuse me, just to interject, a DCF spokesperson did say that it is a very complex challenge and said, quote, rebuilding the capacity of the mental health system will require more than a lawsuit. He goes on to say that many of the youth's behaviors, including fire setting and self-harm, lead to rejections of admission by private residential providers and foster parents concerned about risk from these youth even after discharge from psychiatric hospitals. Do they have a point that some of these kids are pretty hard to place in alternative settings?
So, you know, I really find that response offensive and disingenuous. I say offensive because they're blaming the children. DCFS is the one who cut back the number of beds. That's why they're in this predicament in the first place. And I say,
presumably, wasn't that done under budgetary issues, budgetary constraints, and pressure to reduce budgets that all state agencies have been under?
No, and this is why. Psychiatric hospitalization, it's the most expensive placement option by far for children in DCFS care. Even the most expensive residential placements that DCFS could place these children in are far less than psychiatric hospital beds. This problem is costing you and me and all the taxpayers millions of dollars every year.
Well, if there are a lack of beds, and if some of these facilities are reluctant to, some of the placements are not exactly welcoming of these children, what choice does DCFS really have? You're saying they can put them in available but less expensive alternatives than what they're doing now?
What they need to do is recreate the 500 beds that they've cut in the last 3 years. Instead of cutting those 500 residential beds, they should have been expanding them. It's not a coincidence that during the same period of time that DCFS cut its residential placements, the number of kids who languished in psychiatric hospitals and the length of time that they languished has gone up by almost the same proportion over that period of time. DCFS just needs to create the placements.
Well, let's take a listen to one of the plaintiff's stories. Here it is.
I was there for 6 months. I spent Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, Easter, and my 16th birthday in the hospital. I only got to go outside one time. I felt like a prisoner. I felt very depressed.
What are some of the effects of long-term hospitalization, or at least hospitalization beyond that, which is completely necessary?
Yeah, so all kinds of things. One, the kids can't go to school, so they fall months and months behind in their schoolwork. Two, they see other children come in, get stabilized. Hospitalization is intended to be short-term, at most 2 weeks, and they see other kids come in, get stabilized, and then leave. Over the months that they're stuck there, that makes them feel abandoned. That exacerbates feelings of abandonment. The progress that they've made can retrogress. They see other kids going through acute psychiatric episodes. They learn new psychiatric behaviors that they never learned before. They go outside about 1 hour a day. They can't participate in things that they love, whether it's sports, extracurricular activities, hanging out with their friends, going on dates. It's just a horrible intrusion on their liberty and civil rights.
Charles Galbert, that's where we'll have to leave it. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it. And up next, our political team is back to talk about the mayoral election and more in our weekly roundup, Spotlight Politics.
Don't ever miss Chicago Tonight. Subscribe to our podcast. Get a daily download of our show delivered to your desktop or mobile device. Go to WTTW.com/Chicago Tonight Podcast and subscribe.
A major detente in the race for Chicago mayor, Toni Preckwinkle, announces today she is withdrawing her very public petition challenge of opponent Susana Mendoza. This, as a new poll just out today, puts Preckwinkle and Mendoza at the top of the mayoral field. And just breaking at this hour, a federal and state inquiry into the 13th Ward Aldermanic race. We tackle those stories and more in our weekly Spotlight Politics. And joining us for the inside scoop on all of those stories and more is our political team, Paris Schutz, Amanda Vinicky, and Carol Marine. Well, let's start out with that new poll, colleagues, because it shows that Toni Preckwinkle is on top currently at 21%, and Susana Mendoza at 16%, and then Daley at number 3, and so forth. Much credence to this poll at this point, Carol?
Not for me. You know, part of the problem with polls, and Paris and Amanda and I were just talking about this, it's conventional wisdom to say a poll is just a snapshot in time. Sometimes it's not even a crayon drawing. You know, you have to ask what the methodology is. This poll was 600 respondents. you know, I am of the school, a conservative school in this regard, that I don't believe them necessarily. I just read them very carefully.
Paris Schutz, one of the things that the poll goes on to say is that if the race were one-on-one between Tony Preckwinkle and Susana Mendoza, that in that scenario, currently Susana Mendoza is ahead 45 to 39%. Are the two of them, generally speaking, behind the scenes with people you talk to and so forth, considered like the two front runners, for want of a better term?
Considering what Carol just said, most of the polls have showed the two of them at the top. A new poll that the Preckwinkle Campaign Commission that they just sent out showed the same thing. Preckwinkle at 22%, Mendoza at 12%. Daley at 9% in this poll you talk about, and the fact that Mendoza's petition challenge was dropped today spells a little bit of trouble for him. He wants to slide into a runoff, ostensibly against Tony Preckwinkle, because there would be a very stark choice. So whatever we make of the methodology of the polls, pretty consistently those two have been at the top. But again, there's so many people in this field, and 15 to 20% might get you to a runoff.
I mean, they're seen as the front runners, quote unquote, in part, I think, because of the office that they currently hold.
They have name
and
recognition.
so they have name recognition. They've shown that they can win a race, sure. But we really, I mean, I have to caution every single time we talk about this, it is so early. We don't even know who is going to be on the ballot. I know that's something we're going to talk about shortly, but you have to have the ballot figured out. Then we'll see who gets money, who's really in these communities, who gets traction. It is just way too early to really say, especially in a runoff scenario.
Even with 10 candidates, even with 12 candidates, the percentage that you need to make it to a runoff can be as slender as 14.5%. So
you start going negative in commercials, everything changes.
The Wild West.
That doesn't even happen.
So why is it that Tony Preckwinkle dropped her petition challenge against Susana Mendoza? She was halfway through it. Any ideas?
Too late. Too late. Once you got halfway through it and you knew that it looked like she crossed the threshold to 12,500, maybe 13,000 signatures, there was no point in hanging on.
But it's interesting, the battle may be over on this front, but the war of words just began. So Mendoza sought to frame this as Preckwinkle acting like a boss, as she knew from the beginning that Mendoza's petitions were good. Preckwinkle is saying, well, you shouldn't be too impressed, Chicago voters, because by their account, Mendoza just barely made it across the threshold. So I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The Preckwinkle campaign from the very beginning sought to portray this as a slam dunk case. Mendoza the other way around. I think both campaigns really did have concern and questions, and it was kind of
yeah, they're going after each other. I mean,
right.
Let's be clear. This is war. They want to win. You're going to do everything that you can. To be clear, Preckwinkle has other challenges ongoing. Those continue. So this is not all done on that front. But I guess I'm going to venture that I also think, had it come anywhere near close in terms of getting enough signatures for Mendoza, that could have backfired against Preckwinkle, especially given the framing that Mendoza's tried to put out there, that this is her trying to take out other women of color. That's something that, had she even succeeded,
and say, you tried to do that in the past, Mendoza.
Which is true.
Well, let's talk about let's talk about Bill Daley, because he what is this about his trying to dictate debate terms? Well, he's not showing up at community forums.
He's not showing up at community forums, but his people sent out a kind of offer that we all should gather together, candidates and television media groups, and put together some televised debates. And then enumerated on it was, among other things, the candidates should be able to weigh in on who the reporters might be. You go, what? I don't think so. So
not how it works.
Not how it works. And that it would need to be timed responses a la the League of Women Voters format, which not all of us use. We don't here at WTTW.
Right, it's more of an open conversation, a forum versus a formal debate.
And so it was interesting, but I don't think it will be determinative.
I have to say, Paul Vallis had kind of a funny little reaction that he said, what is this, a rose garden? Particularly because he has been critical of Daley, as have other candidates, for ignoring community forums. While they're out there every night going to neighborhood, they say Daley has been, you know, in Washington, D.C. trying to raise more campaign money.
A wrinkle, and maybe we're getting too much in the weeds for a lot of our viewers, but this is interesting. What's happening in the 13th Ward, Paris? What's going on?
Well, this is where a 19-year-old, Carol first reported this, a 19-year-old DePaul student is trying to challenge the machine, or the organization, the 13th Ward organization, headed up by Mike Madigan. His preferred alderman is Alderman Marty Quinn, and there are these issues with petitions and possibly bullying, people who signed petitions for David Krupa, the 19-year-old, to revoke their petitions. So now ABC7 reports that the FBI is looking into this. We've also confirmed that the state's attorney has made an inquiry in the Chicago Board of Elections. They have asked for documents. They could possibly be opening a case, a criminal case, into possible allegations of fraud on behalf of Madigan's organization.
So David Krupa, I called him an hour ago, and he said that he got a call from someone who identified himself as an FBI agent and wanted to know what had happened.
Because just to be clear, more challenges have been filed against against his petitions than people who signed them.
So the lunacy of this
is confusing.
The lunacy is for a well-oiled machine like Mike Madigan's 13th Ward to have that many affidavits signed by people saying, I want my name taken off David Krupa's petitions, even though it wasn't on David Krupa's petition, is
There were like, what, 2,300 challenges or something in the...
Yes, and there were Krupa only had 1,700 signatures. So a kind of prima facie case, what appears to be election fraud. Okay, so the FBI is making a call. Kim Fox, the state's attorney's office, is saying they're looking into it. Will anything come of it? I've been around a lot of petition cases, and I've never seen anything come of it. But this may be a new day dawning. And so possibly in Illinois, in the county of Cook, we might see it this time.
Let's switch to the state real quickly before we run out of time. Amanda, reports that Governor Rauner attempted to recruit somebody to replace him on the ballot. Tell us about that.
There had been murmurs when it became clear that Rauner wasn't so beloved, that he barely escaped capturing and getting with the Republican nomination for governor. Apparently, also Channel 7 reporting that he had tried to recruit 4 other people in his stead to run for governor. That includes Tom Ricketts, that includes former state senator, Todd Ricketts, that is, I'm sorry, former state senator Karen McConaughey, and also the GOP's nominee for Attorney General Erica Harold. This is pretty wild for an incumbent governor to take that step, especially because it wouldn't be up to him to decide who would take his place if in fact he were to drop out. It would be up to Republican Party leaders. Granted, he has sort of been the head of the party.
McConaughey had a great remark, though. It was, you know, this isn't the way it's done. You don't get to recruit someone to fill in for you
like
in an election.
helping you pick your successor as CEO.
It feeds very much into the perception of Rauner all along.
Pair of shots of Mendoza, Carol Marine, thank you all very much.
You're welcome.
The colder weather may send many Midwesterners indoors, but some adventurous souls say surf's up. Chicago Tonight's Evan Garcia spoke to local surfers who wait for nasty weather before hitting the waves.
Surfing in the winter. You might imagine Hawaii, California, or the Caribbean. But think again. When the weather is just right, surfers ride the waves of Lake Michigan, even in the dead of winter.
My name is Mike Killian. I'm a photographer from Chicago, and today we're surfing the south end of Lake Michigan. We're in northwest Indiana.
Killian and his friend Ian Jacobson are getting ready to hit the waves at Whiting Lakefront Park.
How do you stay warm out there? Like, let me tell you, when you're diving under icy waves and they're coming from every direction, you don't really have an opportunity to be cold. You know, you got your adrenaline going and you're in the moment, and yeah, that definitely adds to the fun.
Beyond adrenaline, surfers are covered head to toe in 1/4-inch thick wetsuits, exposing only their faces. After applying a layer of wax to help stick to his 10-foot longboard, Killian hits the waves. He says his longer surfboard helps him connect with waves before they break.
I like to ride more of a classic style. A lot of people used to ride this style board in like the 60s, and so it's just a little bit more simple.
While Killian paddled from the shore, Chicagoan Rex Flodstrom set off from the rocks with his shortboard.
The shortboard is more high performance, sharper turns and maneuvers. Yeah, the waves are pretty good today. It's kind of windy. We're always hoping it's going to improve, but since there's waves, you might as well try to catch some.
Unlike ocean waves, driven by the gravitational pull of the moon and sun, Lake Michigan's waves are caused by the wind. That's why waves as high as 15 feet or more can reach the south end of Lake Michigan, when a strong north wind travels the 300-mile length of the lake.
The waves are a lot different than the waves on the ocean, as you can tell, but it's still just like the same effect, getting the feeling of riding a wave. It's like unlike anything else, so a lot of guys like to do it just because of that feeling.
At times, the choppy, uneven Lake Michigan surf acts like a washing machine. Josiah Griffin is a regular from nearby Highland, Indiana.
They're pretty big, to be honest. So for us, we're trying to get ahead of the wave before it breaks. Otherwise, we're just gonna get smashed. But we're just trying to stay alive, honestly.
You know, this is a gnarly day out there. It's not clean.
To prepare for optimal conditions, surfers often use forecasting tools, like this one measuring wave height. Some of the biggest waves that day topped 7 feet. Jacobson stands out among the bunch. Literally, he's using a paddle surfboard, which can be a tricky ride.
Fighting the wind, you're like a sail up there when you're on top of that board. The surfers are lower, so they're more resistant to the wind. You know, it's not going to affect them.
And when there's a dozen or so surfers in the water, he's extra careful.
Surfers don't like the paddleboard out there. They see a bigger craft and assume, you know, you're going to get in your way. So, you know, that's one of the things that's always in the back of my mind, just making sure you're out of everyone's way. You just want to make sure in any form of surfing that etiquette's key.
The backdrop of industry on the lake is notable. Surfers have taken legal action against nearby U.S. Steel for toxic spills, and pollution is apparent.
I'm used to it now. I've been surfing here and photographing the scene for 15 years, so you know, it's sad when you come up at the beach and you see all the plastic and trash and everything that's get pushed in here, and there's really nowhere for it to go because all the industry is taking up the shoreline.
But as most surfers on the lake told me, they'll take what they can get. And as the temperatures drop, so does the number of surfers.
Days like today, and as we get further into winter, are days where you're like happy to see somebody because there's going to be less and less people. It's just a good way to get outside and have a good day when it's, what, like 30 degrees?
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Evan Garcia.
Last week, a U.S. magistrate judge allowed the nonprofit Surfrider Foundation to intervene in a federal lawsuit against U.S. Steel filed for violations of the Clean Water Act in Lake Michigan. The legal action is ongoing.
Ask Jeffrey on Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Binny's Beverage Depot.
In 1948, Binny's Beverage Depot opened its first store down the street from Wrigley Field, and for 70 years, Binny's mission has remained the same, helping you celebrate the best times of your life.
Her uncle's tales of childhood hijinks, swiping eggs from a Bronzeville area factory inspired a viewer to ask where such a factory could have been. Local history egg spurt Jeffrey Bear is here with the surprising answer to that and other viewer questions in tonight's Ask Jeffrey. And Jeffrey, good to see you.
I don't know if I'm going to live that introduction down, but okay.
We'll try. Okay. Our first question comes from the West Loop. Do you know of any egg factory in Chicago's Bronzeville area during the 1940s or 50s? My dearly departed Uncle Lamont told us stories how he would, as a young boy, misbehave and steal eggs from a nearby egg factory.
Well, we think Uncle Lamont was maybe swiping eggs from the Murphy Butter and Egg Company, which was at 20th and Calumet, so it's a little bit north of Bronzeville. And actually, as you'll see here, the building is still standing.
And that does not look like an egg factory,
No.
or at least what I envision an egg factory to look like.
Yeah, it doesn't. It was in. It's actually more like a mansion than a butter and egg warehouse. Originally, it was built as a private home for a wealthy Chicago family, and it's been beautifully restored, as you can see. So how it became a storage for a facility for poultry and dairy products is really the story of the rise and fall and rebirth, actually, of this neighborhood. A banker and one-time Chicago Board of Trade president named Calvin Wheeler built the home at 2020 South Calumet in 1870. At the time, the neighborhood, which we now know as the Prairie Avenue Historic District, was fast becoming fashionable for Chicago's early mercantile and industrial barons like George Pullman, Marshall Field, later the Glessners. The neighborhood was often referred to as Chicago's first Gold Coast, and back then sometimes called the sunny street that held the sifted few.
The sifted few.
Indeed. The neighborhood is often filled with, you know, back then with all these captains of industry. It remained a private home, this house, for more than 30 years. But as industry and vice districts sort of encroaching on the neighborhood, the moneyed residents sort of fled en masse to what is today the Gold Coast on the north side. The mansions fell into ruin, like this one, this was the Otis house over on Prairie Avenue, or as in the case of the Wheeler house, which we're talking about, it was converted to other uses. The house was sold to a publishing company, and later in 1944 to the Murphy Butter and Egg Company. Murphy Butter already had its offices in the neighboring house. So if you can see in this photograph, you can just make out a sign on the wall there that says "Good Milk." The Wheeler house is just to the left of that house, which was serving as the office. So after Murphy Butter left the property in the 1980s, the house pretty much sat there vacant for years. It was repeatedly threatened with demolition. Now, I worked as a volunteer tour guide, a docent, at the Glessner House, right, 1 block over on Prairie Avenue in the 1980s. And I can tell you, Phil, back then the neighborhood was pretty desolate, a lot of vacant buildings, vacant lots, things like that.
But the Wheeler house was saved. How did that happen?
Yes, thankfully in 1997, the home was purchased, get this, for $10,000. And after 2 years of restoration, it was granted Chicago landmark status. It's also on the National Register. The buyer, Phil, had a lot of foresight because indeed the South Loop has grown into one of Chicago's hottest neighborhoods now, and today the Wheeler Mansion is a boutique bed and breakfast.
And I bet I know what they serve for breakfast. All right, the next question. What happened to the Fool Killer submarine pulled from the Chicago River in 1915?
A fool killer, yes. So the short answer is no one knows. And Phil, not only is this a mystery, it's one of the most bizarre Chicago stories I have ever encountered.
I had never heard of this.
Yeah, the fool killer. Well, okay, so here we go. It starts with a diver named William Frenchy Deneau. He became kind of a local celebrity following the horrible tragedy of the Eastland disaster in July 1915. You remember that was when a huge steamship tipped over on its side in the Chicago River. More than 800 people were killed. Deneau claimed to have recovered 250 bodies from the river.
Really? Was that true?
Maybe. Deneau is usually described as a showman who doesn't let the facts get in the way of a good story. I actually describe myself that way sometimes.
We've noticed.
A few months later, Deneau was laying cable in a different area of the river when he struck something solid in the muck, and it turned out it was a homemade submarine about 40 feet long. Where it was exactly in the river has been variously reported as Rush Street, Wells Street, Madison Street. Deneau went ahead and got special permission from the federal government to raise it himself in January 1916. And when it was up, Deneau claimed to have discovered human bones and a dog's skull inside. Now, of course, today, a gruesome discovery like that would automatically lead to an investigation by authorities, but Frenchy Deneau, the self-promoter, saw it as a business opportunity, and he displayed his submarine on State Street and charged people a dime for looky-loos to gawp at the submarine and its skeletons. Newspapers immediately floated the theory that the remains inside belonged to a Chicago accountant/inventor named Peter Nissen, who experimented with vessels like this. In fact, people started calling it Fool Killer because that's what Nissen called his inventions, but when someone bothered to fact-check this, they found Nissen had died in another craft in 1904. Others speculated that the skeleton might have been a Michigan City shoemaker named Lodner Phillips, who built primitive subs in the 1840s. It actually looked a lot like the Fool Killer, but like the sub, that theory didn't hold water. Phillips had died in New York, so to this day nobody knows where the skeletons came from. Historians have often wondered whether Deneau planted the skeletons himself in there to boost ticket sales.
And what happened to the submarine?
Well, it appears that Deneau sold it to a carnival, which was called Parker's Greatest Shows, took it to Iowa in the summer of 1916. But a few years ago, a UIC grad student found an ad from September 16, so after the summer, that seems to indicate that the submarine came back to Chicago and was displayed at Riverview Park. At the bottom of this ad, you can see in tiny writing, it says, "See the big submarine Fool Killer." So for now, that's the last we know of it. And by the way, we should thank historian Adam Selzer, who helped us get our story straight on the Fool Killer.
Thank you, Jeffrey, as always.
You're welcome.
And you can find more on this and other Ask Jeffrey stories on our website. Before he took photos of David Bowie, Marlon Brando, and Barbra Streisand, a noted photographer aimed his camera at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and James Baldwin. A pair of new exhibitions offer a side of celebrity, but focus on one man's view of the struggle for civil rights. Steve Shapiro worked for Time and Life magazines during the golden age of photojournalism. We recently met him for the inside story of how he witnessed history and documented it. Here is another look. At Roosevelt University's Gage Gallery, an uncommon photography exhibition looks at contact sheets, all of the images printed from a single roll of film.
Each contact sheet has so many variations on a photograph at times, and you can see the photographer working through their process, working through the event or the stages of the event chronologically.
As a photographer, you covered what was happening during the day and hoped that you got some really good pictures. And then your film went off to Life magazine lab. Basically, your interest at the time was whether my pictures would make the magazine next week. You had no sense that 50 years later we would have exhibitions or that.
Steve Shapiro had a long career taking photographs for magazines and for the movies, where he photographed Marlon Brando on the set of The Godfather and Robert De Niro during the making of Taxi Driver. From 1963 to 1968, Shapiro made indelible images of the civil rights era.
I had heard about things happening in the South, but you never really came to life. You never really experienced it. And it was a faraway situation. Martin Luther King was an amazing spiritual, nonviolent leader. The way he talked really emotionally captivated and energized so many people. When I finally looked at my contact sheet book, which was all the pictures I had taken of King and other leaders and of the civil rights movement, I noticed that there was something in Dr. King's eyes where he would sort of look through the crowd, and you sense that because of all these death threats, he had a forbearance or a sense that something might be happening at any moment.
When King was assassinated, Shapiro photographed the killer's perch in the nearby rooming house in Memphis.
I then went to the Lorraine Motel, and Hosea Williams, who had been one of King's aides, let me in. And I saw on a level shelf King's attaché case, which was open. And then suddenly the image of King came on the television set, which was there behind the commentator. And I photographed it all as one photograph. And to me, it was an important picture because it showed you that the physical man was gone forever, that his material things remained, and yet his spirit hovered over us and still was with us in that sense. And I feel that that's one of the best pictures I've taken.
At the Illinois Holocaust Museum in Skokie, a companion exhibition looks at some of Shapiro's most famous photos of both activists and icons.
Steve Shapiro's work and our exhibition, Activists and Icons, enables us to build on our message here at the museum that we can all be activists by showing us not only the famous folks from the civil rights movement like MLK and John Lewis and Rosa Parks, but the grassroots workers, the students who made it all happen.
It was really a question of capturing the spirit of people involved, the spirit of the movement, of just trying to show what everything was about.
Steve specifically selected this image to be the first image in the exhibition because here you see up close this student, this young person, anonymous, doing the hard work to create the change.
Also on view are Shapiro's portraits of celebrities who challenged cultural norms. We asked him about one of them, a young Muhammad Ali.
He played Monopoly with me, and as we were playing, I was losing, and at one point, it looked like all my property was going to go back to the bank. And Muhammad, who was then Cassius Clay, kept loaning me money so that eventually he would win everything on the board, and he would own absolutely everything.
the work that emerges from both the Holocaust Museum show and our show here at Roosevelt really is a testament to his attention to detail and to seeing things and exploring and, capturing.
There's no real difference in terms of photographing in a documentary way or working on a movie set, in the sense that you're looking for the same things. You're looking for the spirit of a person or the spirit of an event, and that's what you're trying to capture.
Steve Shapiro is still taking photos. Although he's now based in Chicago, he's creating a book of photographs of his native New York. His work is on display at the Gage Gallery of Roosevelt University through Saturday. The exhibition at the Illinois Holocaust Museum is open until October 2019. And you can see more on our website, including a story we did on Steve Shapiro in 2014, where he tells stories about what it was like to photograph David Bowie and to be the set photographer on The Godfather. And that is our show for this Wednesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing and join us tomorrow night live at 7. Elected as a reformer, Kim Foxx reflects on the changes at the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. And after clinching the NFC North in a playoff berth, what's ahead for the Bears in their final 2 regular season games? Big Cat Williams stops by with some answers. And we leave you tonight with a look at a huge canvas on Chicago's Magnificent Mile. This mural is created by artist Ignacio Monreal and is located at 663 North Michigan. Artists are working on it now and plan to have it completed this week. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Phil Ponce, and I thank you for watching. Good night.
Closed captioning for this program is brought to you by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.